Welcome, curious minds, to the deep dive. Today, we're plunging into, well, one of history's really big questions. It's captivating scholars for centuries. Why did Western Europe, and specifically Britain, industrialize and become so economically dominant?
Right.
While these great, long-established agrarian societies in Asia, like China and India, seem to fall behind, it's often called the Great Divergence.
Exactly. And for a long, long time, the conventional wisdom offered a fairly straightforward explanation, didn't it?
It did. Very straightforward.
It basically suggested Europe was somehow inherently different, maybe more rational, maybe it had better institutions, property rights, early capitalism, that sort of thing.
Or even just better weather or resources.
Or even environmental conditions, yeah. And these supposed advantages, the argument went, allowed Europe to achieve this kind of self-sustaining growth.
And we should probably note, this view was largely shaped by European historians, though some Asian voices did echo it too.
That's right. It was the dominant narrative. But then things started to shift, particularly over the last few decades. A new wave of scholarship, really driven by historians of Asia, began to challenge this.
People like Frank Perlin, C.A. Bailey, Jack Goody, Andre Gunder Frank.
Exactly those figures. They started painting a picture of early modern Eurasia that looked, well, surprisingly similar across the board.
Similar how?
They found these amazing connections, monetary relations spanning from Europe right across to China, even West Africa, and really strong parallels in economic structures, say, in India. It seriously questioned that whole idea of European uniqueness.
Okay, so that brings us to today's deep dive. We're focusing on a really pivotal work in this debate, Kenneth Pomeranz's book, The Great Divergence, China, Europe, and the Making of the Modern World Economy.
A huge book. And we'll unpack his groundbreaking ideas,
Right.
But then we'll also bring in a critical review by President Parthasarathi.
Right, because Parthasarathi argues that even with Pomeranz's contribution, which was massive,
Oh, undeniably.
the full story of why Europe diverged might be, well, even more complex.
Precisely. So our mission today is to unpack Pomeranz, explore that critique, and basically give you a shortcut to understanding how historical fact gets debated and reshaped. It's a fascinating story.
Absolutely. Prepare to have some assumptions challenged. Let's start with Pomeranz's core claim. It was pretty radical, wasn't it?
It really was. Pomeranz starts by arguing that back in the 18th century, the most advanced parts of Europe and Asia were, economically speaking, remarkably similar.
Similar, not Europe already being way ahead.
Exactly. This just flies in the face of that long-held idea of European superiority before industrialization. It completely flips the traditional script.
Okay, that's a huge claim. Similar in what ways?
Yeah.
What kind of evidence did he actually bring to the table?
Well, he marshals a lot of evidence. Things like life expectancy, wage rates, consumption patterns, both for everyday stuff and luxuries. He argues these were broadly comparable.
Comparable between where?
Between the core regions. So think northwestern Europe, yes, but also key areas in China, like the Yangtze Delta, Japan, parts of India, Southeast Asia.
And he gets quite specific, doesn't he? I remember reading about comparisons of, transport capacity.
Yeah, like transport in Germany versus North India, or fuel supply issues in France compared to Linyan or northern China, even down to manure use in North China and Europe.
Wow.
All pointing towards these broad similarities. Not identical, of course, but much closer than the old narrative allowed.
So it wasn't just living standards.
No, he also argues that the economic fundamentals weren't that different either. Property rights and land, financial assets, they weren't fundamentally dissimilar.
And markets. The idea was always that Europe had superior markets.
Pomeranz challenges that. He says markets were widespread and pretty efficient resource allocators in Asia, too. And the availability, the deployment of capital, both human capital, skills, and physical capital, didn't show some massive gap between East and West back then.
So the big takeaway, the aha moment from Pomeranz is, if these regions were so similar economically in the 18th century,
Right.
then the divergence, the Industrial Revolution kicking off in Britain, wasn't because Europe was just inherently better or destined for it from the start.
Exactly. It implies the divergence was more contingent, more specific to certain later factors, not some deep-rooted, long-term European advantage. It changes everything.
Okay, so if they were so similar and both hitting some kind of limits, what did cause the divergence, according to Pomeranz?
This leads to his next big idea. He argues that both advanced Europe, specifically Britain, and advanced China, especially the lower Yangtze Valley, were facing significant ecological constraints,
Meaning?
basically limits on land. Land for food, land for fibers like cotton or flax, and crucially, land for fuel wood, mainly. They were both bumping up against resource ceilings.
Right, the Malthusian trap idea, but applied comparatively. How did he approach comparing them? He used a specific method, didn't he?
He did, yeah. He borrowed this reciprocal comparison idea from R. Bin Wang. It's quite clever.
How does it work?
Instead of just assuming Europe is the norm and asking why China failed to be like Europe.
Which was the old way.
Totally. He looks at both Europe and China as potential deviations from a shared path. He asks what absences, accidents, and obstacles diverted England away from a path that might have made it look more like the Yangtze Delta.
That's a much more balanced way to ask the question. It avoids assuming European exceptionalism from the get-go.
Exactly. It frames the problem much more neutrally.
So using this method, what did Pomeranz conclude? Why did Britain escape this ecological trap, in his view?
He argues Britain benefited from two critical factors, what he calls the dual boons.
Okay, boon number one.
Coal. Abundant, easily accessible coal. Building on work by people like E.A. Wrigley, he emphasizes how coal allowed Britain to replace timber, especially in iron making, and crucially, to power the steam engine. It was a massive energy windfall.
Right, freeing them from the limits of wood fuel.
Right.
What was the second boon?
The New World, specifically the plantation complex. This provided Britain with, first, cheap calories from sugar.
Keeping the workforce fed cheaply.
And second, vast amounts of cheap cotton for the textile mills mushrooming in places like Manchester. Plus, he adds New World silver as another helpful windfall for European economies.
So coal for energy, and the Americas for food and raw materials. A potent combination. What about China then? Why couldn't the Yangtze Delta tap into similar resources?
Well, Pomeranz argues that China's situation was different. The lower Yangtze Valley, its economic heartland, was geographically distant from China's main coal deposits, which were mostly in the north and not heavily exploited yet.
So no easy coal access.
Right. And crucially, China didn't have the equivalent of the Americas, a vast exploitable overseas periphery to supply cheap agricultural goods and resources on the same scale.
Okay, so Britain gets lucky with coal and colonies, China doesn't. And the result, according to Pomeranz,
the result, in his view, was that China couldn't escape those ecological pressures. Population growth in the 19th century led to ecological strain and economic problems.
And he argues historians mistakenly read that 19th century decline back into earlier periods.
Precisely. He argues they missed the earlier period of similarity and dynamism because they were looking through the lens of later problems. His work is justifiably seen as a major corrective.
A seminal contribution, definitely. It shifted the entire ground of the debate.
No question. He made it much harder to sustain those old, glib assumptions of European superiority right from the start.
Okay, so Pomeranz provides this powerful explanation based on ecology and geography, coal and colonies. But, as you mentioned, the review by Prezan and Parthasarathi raises some critical questions about that explanation.
That's right. Parthasarathi acknowledges Pomeranz's huge impact, calling it a much-needed corrective. But he argues that Pomeranz's explanation for why the divergence happened is, let's say, more problematic.
What are the main issues Parthasarathi raises?
Well, one issue is with the reciprocal comparison method itself. While it's useful, Parthasarathi suggests it can sometimes treat these regions a bit too much in isolation.
How so?
It can downplay the crucial interactions and exchanges between Europe and Asia, especially the trade in manufactured goods, which created economic pressures and opportunities globally. That dynamic gets a bit lost sometimes.
Okay, so it misses some of the interconnectedness. What else?
A really big critique is the limited discussion of politics in the state. Parthasarathi argues that state policies were actually fundamental to economic development in Western Europe, especially Britain. Pomeranz doesn't focus heavily on that.
And labor, too.
And labor, yes. There's relatively little on what Parthasarathi calls the politics of labor disciplining. Things like how work was organized, how labor was controlled. These were huge parts of the economic and social changes in early modern Europe, but they're not central to Pomeranz's ecological argument.
So, Parthasarathi wants to bring state policy and labor dynamics back into the picture more forcefully. What about technology? Pomeranz seems to suggest technology just sort of became available.
Yeah, that's another key point. Parthasarathi asks a prior question, why? Why did Northwestern Europe, and Britain in particular, experience these revolutionary technological breakthroughs between, say, 1750 and 1850?
The ones that led to the massive transformation of manufacturing.
Exactly. Something that just didn't happen on the same scale in Asia. Was it really just about overcoming an ecological bottleneck, as Pomeranz implies? Or was something else driving that innovation?
Good question. So take coal adoption, for instance. Was it purely about running out of wood?
Parthasarathi suggests it's more complex. For example, British charcoal prices were apparently quite stable in the early 18th century. There wasn't necessarily a critical timber shortage forcing the switch right then.
So what encouraged the shift to coal and iron making?
He points to factors like a surge in demand for iron, but also competition from cheap iron imports from places like Sweden and Russia. This might have made developing coal-based technology more economically attractive because of cost structures and market competition, not just because timber was disappearing.
Right. Like Carlos Cipolla argued, the Industrial Revolution didn't just respond to energy needs, it introduced new ways of exploiting energy.
Precisely. And think about cotton. Pomeranz emphasizes the New World supplying cheap cotton, but Parthasarathi flips it.
How?
He argues the enormous demand for cotton in Britain was itself a product of British technological breakthroughs in spinning and weaving. The innovation created the massive demand as much as the supply enabled the innovation. It's a feedback loop.
A chicken and egg situation almost.
Sort of, yeah. And here's a fascinating detail Parthasarathi highlights, one Pomeranz overlooks. The huge imports of Indian cotton into Canton, China, starting in the 1780s.
Indian cotton going to China.
Yes, massive amounts. In the 1830s and 40s, it was averaging over 80 million pounds a year from India into Canton. That's comparable to British cotton imports around 1815.
Wow. So that suggests the Yangtze Delta did have access to an external periphery for raw materials, contradicting Pomeranz's point a bit.
It does. And significantly, this trade eventually declined because of competition from cheap British and American machine-spun yarn entering China.
Ah, so it wasn't just ecological limits holding China back, but direct industrial competition from the West.
That's what Parthasarathi implies. It suggests factors beyond ecology were key to China's changing economic fortunes.
And even the sugar story is more complex, right? It wasn't just about calories from the New World plantations.
No. After slavery was abolished, Britain imported sugar from Africa and India too. And building on Sidney Mintz's incredible work, the rise in sugar consumption in Britain also reflected deep social inequality.
How so?
Mintz showed how often working-class men got the meat and more expensive foods, while women and children relied more heavily on cheaper calories from sugar and jam with bread. It's a story about class and gender relations within Britain, not just colonial exploitation providing calories.
Okay, so Pomeranz gives us the ecological constraints, but Parthasarathi pushes back, emphasizing global interactions, state policy, labor, and the drivers of technology. This suggests an alternative way to frame the divergence.
Exactly. Let's shift the perspective for a moment. Parthasarathi argues that in the 18th century, advanced parts of Europe, including Britain, were actually at a serious competitive disadvantage globally, especially in textiles and iron.
Disadvantage? How?
Because core regions in Asia, particularly India, could produce these manufactured goods much more cheaply. A key reason was lower grain prices, which meant lower subsistence costs and wages. European producers often couldn't compete on price.
So Asia had the edge initially. How does this reinterpret the Great Divergence?
It suggests the divergence wasn't about Europe starting ahead, but about how Europe, especially Britain, responded to this competitive pressure. It becomes a story about the intersection of global competition and specific European, particularly British political and economic institutions.
Institutions and policies reacting to being behind.
In a way, yes. This framework argues that competition and state policies actively drove technological change and the reorganization of work in Europe precisely because they were trying to catch up or overcome Asian advantages in certain sectors.
Okay, let's look at those key industries again.
Yeah.
Cotton and iron.
Right, the absolute engines of British growth from roughly 1760 to 1830. Cotton alone might account for half the productivity growth in that period.
And their rise had huge knock-on effects.
Massive, fueling steam power development, providing profits for railways, spurring innovations like iron-framed buildings, gas lighting, specialized machinery, the list goes on.
So why did Britain innovate so dramatically in these industries if Asia was already so competitive?
This is where the competitive pressure argument really comes in. Take cotton. Parthasarathi argues British producers were relentlessly driven by the need to compete with and ultimately outproduce Indian textiles.
They were actively trying to beat India.
Absolutely. Manufacturers closely watched Indian muslin markets and prices. Early Lancashire producers literally copied Indian designs for markets like West Africa. They had to innovate to survive and capture those markets.
Whereas Indian or Chinese producers,
They were often dominating global trade or were largely self-sufficient. They simply didn't face the same intense existential pressure to mechanize and revolutionize production. They were already successful with existing methods.
that makes sense. No pressure, less drive for radical change. What about iron?
A similar story, Parthasarathi suggests, British iron masters faced tough competition from those cheap, high-quality imports from Sweden and Russia. This directly spurred technological innovation to lower costs and improve quality.
While Indian iron.
Indian iron was often already cheap and high quality, even exported. Again, less internal pressure for radical technological shifts. And state demand, like the British Navy's huge need for iron for ships and cannons, also played a big role in pushing British production forward.
So competition was a major spur. How did the British state policy fit into this? You mentioned mercantilism.
Right. Britain had this strong mercantilist ideology, prioritizing domestic production over imports, even if imports were cheaper initially. The state actively protected its home market for textiles and iron with tariffs and regulations.
Creating a sheltered space for these infant industries to grow and innovate.
Exactly. It allowed them to get on their feet and respond to that foreign competition without being immediately swamped.
How did that compare to elsewhere?
Contrast that with, say, the Ottoman Empire, whose policies often focused more on provisioning, ensuring cheap goods for consumers regardless of origin. That offered little protection for local producers trying to compete.
Or Safavid Iran.
In Safavid Iran, the relative lack of restrictions on importing Indian cloth apparently led to a significant outflow of silver to pay for it, a specie drain, which wasn't great for the local economy or producers. British policy was much more deliberately protectionist and developmental.
Okay, so protectionism nurtured industry. What about the labor side of state policy?
This is crucial and often overlooked. Parthasarathi argues the British state played a decisive role in, well, disciplining labor.
What does that mean in practice?
It means things like the increasing regimentation of work, the intensification of the working day, longer hours, the rise of the factory system itself.
Which Samuel Oldknow, a key innovator, adopted partly due to pressure from Indian and other British competitors.
Exactly. All this was heavily dependent on state backing. Policies like the Combination Acts restricting worker organization, laws limiting labor mobility, strict enforcement of contracts favoring employers.
So the state helped create a more controlled, more intensively worked labor force.
That's the argument. This particular state labor dynamic, allowing for such intensification and control, was largely absent or different in many parts of Asia.
For instance,
Well, examples given include Safavid Iran, where peasants apparently retained rights to rebel or flee harsh conditions, or the Ottoman Empire, where guilds often kept significant monopoly privileges, making it harder to reorganize work or impose factory discipline in the same way.
so the ability of the British state to shape the labor market was another key difference.
A very important one, according to this perspective.
Okay, this paints a much more complex picture than just coal and colonies. So, summing up, where does this leave us in understanding the Great Divergence?
Well, first, we absolutely have to credit Kenneth Pomeranz. His book fundamentally changed the conversation. He showed those surprising similarities between East and West before the divergence, making the old Eurocentric arguments really difficult to sustain.
He definitely raised the bar for the whole debate.
Hugely. He elevated the discussion to a much higher plane, forcing everyone to reconsider the baseline. Historians like Parthasarathi are building on and reacting to the world Pomeranz revealed.
But, as we've discussed, while Pomeranz's insights on the similarities and his focus on ecological factors are vital.
They might not be the whole story of the divergence itself.
Right. You now understand, hopefully, that explaining the divergence requires looking beyond just ecology. It's a much richer, more tangled story.
It involves these complex interactions between regions, the critical role of technology, but technology often driven by fierce competitive pressures.
The really significant influence of specific state policies like protectionism and labor regulation.
And the dynamics of labor relations themselves, which varied considerably across Eurasia. It's not one single cause.
It really underscores that understanding big historical shifts, like economic development, is rarely about finding one simple answer. It's almost always a dynamic interplay of many different factors.
Absolutely. Ecology, technology, politics, competition, labor, they all weave together.
So here's a final thought for you, our listeners, to mull over. Thinking about this complex historical interplay, ecology, tech, state action, labor, competition, how might that shape how you look at economic development challenges and opportunities around the world today? Are we still seeing echoes of these dynamics? Something to think about.